Hi there. Welcome to Psyched. I'm here today, Energy Into It with Dr. Suzanne Manser, and we're excited to talk to you again today about some of the similarities and differences that we see in our practices. Suzanne Manser is a clinical psychologist. Dr. Suzanne Manser is a clinical psychologist. I am a psychic medium, not a psychologist. And we created this series to talk about some of the differences and similarities that we both see in the world, in our practices, how we help people to help all of you. Today, we decided that we are going to talk about the patriarchy. Given the climate where we sit today is we're recording on Friday, February 20th, 2026. So we now for the last 3 weeks have had a lot of information available to us in the US and all over the world from our government, from our Justice Department on the PDF files that everyone's talking about. I don't want to start naming names or start naming terms in that way. So we're going to keep it as sort of PG as we can in that regard, even with reference to things, but I think you guys know what we're talking about. We've been in this climate really of kind of a reckoning with the patriarchy and so many things, right? And so Suzanne and I, when we were talking about what we wanted to talk about today with everyone in our audience, we thought it was just a great topic to kind of bring up and table, even if we feel like we're fumbling through with some of this stuff. In terms of patriarchy, what that's done to, how we see ourselves as women, um, and on and on. So we'll go ahead and jump in, and we're excited to be here with you guys. Suzanne, I would love to hear a little bit about how you experience this in your practice with patients and how you help them have realizations around, particularly because I know that you work with patients with diet culture challenges and things like that. Topic comes up a lot for you in your practice because of your client base. And so I would imagine you deal with this a lot in helping patients point them back to different places other than just sort of the view of patriarchy and how they see their body. So how about I'll quit talking and I'll just let you take over the mic.
Thank you, Angela. Yeah, so my one of my specialties is working with folks with eating disorders and body image issues, and um, not that that needs to be any sort of topic for the patriarchy to have an influence, but that certainly is a big way that the patriarchy has had an influence. And so just thinking about when my patients come in and they have feelings about their worth and their bodies, sticking to the body stuff for a moment. I also want to talk about not body stuff, but sticking to the diet culture and the thin ideal, the idea that we all have to fit or we should all fit into this very thin body in order to be acceptable, worthwhile human beings, which is total BS, but that is the line that our culture is promoting. Um, the thin ideal, I'm just going to go there real quick, was created hundreds of years ago when white people were trying to enslave and oppress people of color. One of the ways that white people convinced other white people that these other folks were others and were less than was their body size. People who had a bigger body size said white people were morally inferior based on absolutely nothing, obviously. But that has continued. And so it is, hundreds of years later, all of us of all different colors are now really ensnared in this thin ideal that if we don't fit a certain body size, if we don't look a certain way, that speaks to our worth as human beings. And that's 100% made up. There's not even the connection between weight and health that we once believed that there was. So that's just a really specific and kind of easy example to point to of how
Mhm.
it was men back then doing the enslaving and oppressing,
Mhm.
how the patriarchy, still impacts things like that. Again, I say still, but we are all so involved in the patriarchy, whether we want to be or not. There's so much talk about the male gaze, for example, and
Mhm.
the idea that as women, we need to please men with, again, our appearance, our aesthetics. And if we don't feel like we are being pleasing to men, we feel less than, we feel inferior, and our worth takes a hit. And so, and then there's all the other stuff. There's the wage gap and,
Mhm.
the helplessness that the patriarchy has created for people who don't identify as men. And so all of these pieces come together to make women and other people who don't identify as men or males, we're stuck. We're really stuck in this very small space that we're allowed to be in. And that doesn't give us, or we don't feel like we have the agency to break out of that really small space. So part of the work that I do is getting people to see that distinction between what they believe and what they've been trained to believe. And once they can sort of see that distinction, then we've got a lot of work that we can do in terms of, okay, well, if you believe what the patriarchy has taught you to believe, do you want to believe that? You know, once we see it as a product of the patriarchy, is there some room to start to see yourself differently? Can you start to play with the idea that regardless of what your body looks like, what you look like, that you have worth and that your worth has absolutely nothing to do with your body size. So I feel like I just have been talking and talking and talking about this, but I see it, I mean, I can't imagine that an hour goes by that the patriarchy is not in my office impacting the people in my office. And so it's especially right now with all of the news and all of the people who have been hurt who are finally being heard.
Mhm.
It's so important to make that distinction and say, wait a minute, these are rules that we didn't have any participation in making. They are not serving us, obviously. Maybe we don't actually want to live by them. And that's a freedom that when you can make that distinction and see that you have some agency there,
Mhm.
that's a freedom that makes a huge difference for people's sense of worth, for people's sense of hope, for people's
Mhm.
moods, for all of that.
Really well said. One thing that I think is important to talk about is when we talk about patriarchy, and I didn't do a good job of this at the beginning, setting this up. When we talk about patriarchy or the patriarchy, and thank you, Suzanne, for all of that that you shared. It was really so helpful to hear about. We're talking about a system. We're not talking about being anti-men or just men or something or being men hating, right? So a patriarchal system in a really basic way is tends to be set up hierarchically, where there's someone on the top and then there's a hierarchy underneath. It's very linear, it breeds competition, right? And so it's a top-down thing where someone has all the power and resources at the top. And so as I say that, hopefully people can start to begin to also conceptualize how the patriarchy affects so many things, our economy, our work, our jobs, right? Like we live in this space of like always feeling like we're supposed to be competing because that's part of the patriarchal system and what it's set us up to do. Or parenting, right? All of it. I was just reading something and having ahas the other day about sleep training and how that comes from the patriarchy and the inconvenience of the dads not wanting to be awakened before they had to go for a work day, right? Like from the 50s or something when sleep training came in 40s or 50s, right? So, like the patriarchal system is the whole system that we live in that's far less about men and much more about competition and hierarchy and top down. And the suggestion that there are these ideals, right? If it's top down and everybody's not valued, then we're scrambling to be valued, right? And then you add the stuff with the files. And for me at least, when I have those realizations of like, and now I'm trying to compete with like a teenage version of myself. Like, what am I thinking? Trying to um, be interested in the gaze from a man that's based upon all of these things, right? That I've just sort of said and you've said. So it's really, really huge. Whereas a matriarchal system, and there have been some through history, but they've mostly been more tribal and in smaller groups. I think it's been a really long time since we've had big matriarchal civilizations and systems. I have not done research on that to have resources for you, but it's community oriented and it centers the children and the women. It centers the vulnerable. It sees the children as the future and it invests in the children versus, the men and the companies that serve the men, that serve the families, that top down, right? It's about, and a lot of this is the way that I conceptualize it as well as what I've learned about it, but it's more circular. It's got the women and the children at the center. And in a lot of the true matriarchal cultures, they have zero tolerance for things like harming a child in the ways that we're learning that children and women have been harmed through this, big release of information in the last few weeks. And it sort of nurtures and protects the women and the children at its heart. And it's a spiral, and everyone's seen as valuable and has their place in the community and their role. And it's not about competition. Nobody gets left out. It's not about exclusion. It's about inclusion and protection. And so I just wanted to make sure to give a little bit of voice to that as we're talking about this, that we're not sitting here trying to bash men. It's a whole bunch of realizations that can come out. Yes, whether about body shape, size, and all of that, that's where we started our conversation, or just about our motivations from this system to do anything in life, you know? I mean, that's what I'm sitting with at 58 years old, right? I'm like, God, almost 6 decades of like, I've been saying, I feel like we're all born in the cult of patriarchy. It feels like a cult when you start to get that distance, like you talked about helping your patients get from the system. It's helpful. And then it can also be a little bit overwhelming because then the realizations are like dominoes going down, right?
Well, can I jump in, Angela? First of all, thank you for setting that up and explaining what the patriarchy is. And I just totally jumped in and talked about men, and I apologize. I do not mean to be saying it is all about men, of course. It is for sure the system that we're talking about here.
Mm.
But your point about, and because I spend so much of my professional time working with people who are embedded and engrossed in diet culture, that is the lens that I tend to think about this through. But when you're talking about patriarchy and the competition that it sets up, and that it prizes, it reminded me or made me think about the way I have a particular I have a particular pet peeve when people talk about always do your best. You got to be your best self all the time. That drives me crazy. I get it, but I think it is way too much pressure and not realistic to think that we are supposed to be our best selves all the time. And that, I mean, I had never thought about it through the lens of the patriarchy before, but of course that is what that is. And I'm just really appreciating the reminder that competition is a lens, it is a choice, it is a path, but it is not the path for everyone, nor is it healthy for everyone in the way that it's been set up systemically. And
Mhm.
the idea that we get to just if we choose to, we get to just live our lives, not striving to be the best, not trying to do all the things, but just having experiences, feeling our feelings, being ourselves. And that is not only a perfectly acceptable way, but that sounds like a really lovely way to live. So I just really want to put out there that I think and certainly I grew up in a space where if you weren't doing your best, if you weren't trying to achieve, if you weren't accomplishing, that really spoke to your value and your worth. And just a reminder that that comes from patriarchy.
Yeah, so well said. It's so true. All of it. Even I had a conversation a few months back. I had someone say to me, it was a white guy, in my age band, close to retirement, and he was a neighbor. It was an inappropriate question for him to ask me, but he started asking about when I plan to retire. And in that moment, this was like 6 months ago, I started thinking about like, God, I guess people still ask people this. Like, I guess people are still sort of gunning for a lot of these things, making these assumptions about where they are in life and that they're on this patriarchal trajectory that was ingrained into us. That this is the way that we're all supposed to be living. This is what we're supposed to be talking about at this age, right? I was starting to have those realizations in my conversation with this person, just even, from that standpoint. So it's really, it's deep and far and wide when you think about it. And I agree with you. I'm like, bring on the matriarchy. Like, sure, I would love to be less, trying to like kick my own rear, thinking that there's something wrong with me if I'm tired or not doing my best, like you said, and in my work and all the things, right? Like when you start to think about how this system has affected all of us in these ways, it's pretty endless. All of it, even like being at work on time, those kinds of things, like it's just sort of never ending. And it could just be so different. And so that's the other thing. There's so many of us that at this time in history that are like, burn it all down, the systems. I say that all the time. And the reality is that things don't necessarily change overnight that suddenly, and that wouldn't necessarily be helpful if everything was just burned to the ground and we started out new. And this is one of the things we can do that I think is really important for us to talk about and to kind of guide a bit and remind our listeners of is that well, first of all, I'm going to lean back and give a little bit of astrology. Today's a really powerful day. And one of the best things we can do to honor the astrology that we're experiencing today, technically speaking, the planet Saturn and the planet Neptune are they're in the same sign, and so it's called a conjunction, and they're in 0 degrees of Aries. Aries is the first sign in the zodiac, 0 degrees is the beginning degrees for anything in astrology, right? So it's this huge fresh start inflection point. This astrology in this sign has not happened for 6,000 years. So this is a beautiful day for me to say to you, Suzanne, and remind our audience that dreaming, because Neptune's the planet of dreaming, Saturn's the planet of structures, these two doing what they're doing sets us up on this planet for like huge dreams, huge possibilities, huge hope. And so while we're talking about the system and I say things like burn it all down, I encourage everyone to think about a few things that you would love to see differently in the world, right? So if you're a more practical person and you're thinking, well, I just want to, have people smile at me, even if I'm not a thin person, if I walk down the street, and I just want to, feel less pressure to be my best. Great. Like I think those are really good things for us to think about instead of just grinding on how crappy things are right now, right? And so those are the things we can do is kind of dream and vision what it is that you would like to see. Or maybe some of those aspects of the patriarchy that have been so unkind to so many of us, perhaps start there and just think about, whew, if we could get rid of this piece, that would be great. Let's think about how we can do that, right? And so I encourage people to stay open to dreaming because of the power and potency of the astrology today. And this is opening up a whole new phase. It isn't just today, but today happens to be kind of a starting point for it. So we've got all of this possibility with this astrology, but just remembering to keep dreaming. And then, from the dreams is when we come upon the things that we're like, oh, I could do that, or I know how I could do that in my community. And that's how we create change, right? Is allowing ourselves to dream and then taking action when it feels right.
And I love, Angela, I don't know if this is how you meant it, but the way that you were talking about about dreaming, the unfettered nature of it, it's not fettered, is that a word, by the patriarchy or the rules or the whatever.
Mhm.
And that expansiveness and openness is probably anti-patriarchal, but also just a really lovely space to be in, just the space of possibility. There's a psychological tool that I use all the time called affirmations, not affirmations, but affirmations, and it's a what if question. So what if we became a matriarchy? Maybe that's a far-fetched question, but if you start asking that question, what if we became a matriarchy? Turns out your brain, the creativity center of your brain lights up when you ask a what if question.
Mm,
So they're
mhm,
actually kind of more useful, I think, than affirmations when you ask an affirmation because it gets your brain engaged. But I
mhm.
think it is a good way to just, throw out the big questions. What if we lived in a matriarchy? Then your brain starts to ponder what that could look like. And like you said, then that gives you like a pathway to, oh, what changes could I make? How could I think differently? How could I see myself differently that would serve and support me and make my life and those around me feel better?
I love that. And I love hearing that it lights up the creative part of your brain. I'm going to jump in with some of my psychic tools here because love your affirmations. I became aware of them. They had a different name, and I'm not even going to cite it because it was a white guy that wrote about, I'm like, we'll stick with it for affirmations. I love them. But so when you do that, when you ask that question, what if, or, however you phrase the affirmation, asking the question and lighting up that part of your brain, often psychic messages drop in. So I also encourage people to learn about affirmations from Suzanne and use them because just like you said, it brings answers psychically. And whatever you feel or think or hear or see, depending on where you are with your intuition and like your capacity to understand what you're experiencing psychically, it's a beautiful direct pathway to usher in a message from sort of spirit or the psychic realms or your higher self, however you want to conceptualize that, by asking that question and igniting that part of your brain. So yeah, I wanted to put a plug in for
Oh,
psychic
I
skills
love
right
that.
there.
That's really
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah, yeah. That's
Yeah.
great.
And it's that question that affirmations do. When we're doing affirmations, we're just saying the statements. I think it's really easy for our brains and our subconscious to get like tolerant and just hear it as Charlie Brown's teacher.
Hmm.
And then, like you said, when you ask the question, it lights up that other part of your brain. It really does. And yay, we covered neuroscience today too. It lights up a different part of your brain.
Neuroscience rocks, doesn't
It sure does. It sure does.
it?
This is reminding me of an author and her body of work that I like to cite, and I'd like to share with our audience here too, in case this helps anyone, especially perhaps if you're sitting with some of the tough stuff that we've been talking about with the patriarchy and the patriarchal system, and you're trying to sort of move through some heavy feelings or move through sort of beliefs or having kind of, part of your head blown off because you're like just mind blown, starting to conceptualize how much the patriarchy perhaps has affected your life. Byron Katie is her name, Byron. Last name is Katie, and she has a body of work called The Work. And I think it's from the 90s. I think it's last century. It could be early 2000s. But I read her book and I listened to The Work on some back when they were sold via CDs. So it was late 90s, early 2000s before everything went so digital. And essentially, she incorporates in this work what I would call the Socratic method of just asking those deeper, continue to ask yourself, why, is this true? Is this true? Is this true? When you're sitting with something. So if you're looking to kind of dig a little bit deeper into, is this true? Does this have merit? Is this really how I feel? Is this really appropriate? Whether it's someone's opinion about our body or, a way we've been affected by the system. I like her work because I feel like it helps us to sort of like cut to the answers more quickly. But why? But why? But why? How do you know? Is that true? Is that true? Is that true? So I offer that up in case that's helpful to anyone.
And, I haven't heard of her or her work. I'm really interested in to go check it out. And what it makes me think about is I think because the patriarchy and many other systems are so
Mhm.
systemic, they're like the air we
Mhm.
breathe. We don't even know that they're there, which is what we're talking
Mhm.
about. Once we know that they're there and we can see how they've been impacting us, we can finally make changes. Um, but that I was just thinking about the why questions, and I bet a lot of people wouldn't even know what the first question would be because it's
Mm.
so like air. Like what is the first question? And so, there might be a really um, cool or interesting way to just start that off by thinking about um, one thing about yourself that doesn't feel, not about yourself, about your life, maybe that doesn't feel satisfying, and just starting to think about what systems are impacting that you could
Mhm.
start to investigate and question. And through that line of questioning, start to get to the whys and start to get to the where can things be changed and how can I make changes. So I don't know. I think
Love
that
that.
the
Yeah,
very
that's
first
helpful.
recognition of, oh, this is an actual system that's impacting me, that moment is so, I think it's a light bulb moment for a lot of people, but getting there is so challenging.
Agreed. And when you
Unfortunately,
were
the files are helping, but fortunately or unfortunately, the files are helping us see the
Yeah,
system.
I hear you. I hear you. Agreed. When you brought that up, what came to mind for me is something not at all threatening to me or not at all upsetting to me. It's just funny. What popped up for me psychically was my like decision for my major and how I sort of went through university. And that would be something that was a lot of, I'm a pretty strong-willed personality if you didn't know that about me. And so that's one that I feel like was not necessarily impacted by the patriarchy or my father at all. And so I think that that's the other thing too, is perhaps start when you're trying to think about what the first question is, perhaps consider something that feels less big, and maybe you feel even neutral about it and just do some of those examination questions to see where it takes you. Yeah.
That's great. That's
Yeah.
great.
One thing that you and I were talking about before we were recording was this concept of going back a little bit to the patriarchy and the files, unfortunately, and body image and those kinds of things. Um, we were talking about sort of the quality of having the approval from someone else be way out there from us versus it being in here from us. And so you were telling me a little bit about how you help your patients get some distance from that or pull their power back into them. Is that correct? Did I say that right?
Yes. Well, yeah, yes. I think that the ability to I think we're not in some ways, and again, I'm so glad we're having this conversation because I'm like, oh, patriarchy, 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 patriarchy. Like, yeah, I'm getting it. But I think we're so used to not owning ourselves, not feeling like we get
Mhm,
to own ourselves, if that makes
mhm,
sense. And I mean, own our feelings, own our reactions, own our
mhm,
beliefs. We keep checking out, do other people, is that okay with other people if I feel this way or see things this way? And
mhm,
so, just taking kind of like what you were just saying before about starting with little things, but taking a smaller, kind of less threatening thing and just starting to, I think I'm repeating myself, but picture or think
mhm,
about what if this is just mine? If
mhm,
this doesn't have anybody else's influence on it, if nobody else gets to tell me that they approve or disapprove of this, whether it's the shirt I'm wearing today or
mhm,
the major that I choose
mhm,
or where I choose to live in the world,
mhm,
um, kind of have doing this exercise of if this is just mine, if I don't have anybody else's influence, what would that feel like? What would that look like? What would I be thinking about? What would I be considering? Because
mhm,
I can tell you when I pick clothes, unfortunately, I am still freaking considering the male gaze a lot.
mhm.
And if I ask myself that, you know, you can't really see I'm going to show you the pants I'm wearing. Oh, you can't see them. These are
Nice,
the pants I'm wearing.
nice.
For whatever reason, I consider these pants, which are I don't know why they're white with blue stripes, but I consider them not attractive to the male gaze. It's super comfortable for me, and I just
Mhm,
really like them. And so that's an example of, I stupidly I had to kind of make the decision like, yeah, nobody might think these pants are attractive, but I really love them, so I'm going to wear them. And I
right
hope that
on.
lots of people are doing this lots of the time, but
Mhm,
to stop and think about why am I choosing this article of clothing? Why am I choosing
mhm,
this thing? Um, I bet if I asked myself every single, why did I do every single thing today? The patriarchy would come up way more than I'm comfortable with. So I
mhm,
think that's
mhm,
a great way to just start to suss out kind of who's influencing you in any given moment. Is it you or is it a system?
mhm, mhm, mhm. Yeah, very well said. And I love your pants, and I'm glad you chose comfortable pants today. Way to go.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, I'm in a unique position as a 58-year-old woman who's an empty nester and divorced for a long time and live alone. And so that's been really helpful for me to do what you were just talking about and really because I'm no longer looking towards, is this going to embarrass my kids if I wear this, right? When they're teenagers, is it, all the things that the patriarchy teaches us to kind of vet, in a way that we take in so deeply as women and just sort of live to that, just anyway, to the nth degree. And so I get to do that every day, and it's really liberating. So I recommend, what you recommended for people to try it because it is really liberating. Even from a family standpoint, when we step back and think about how many decisions we make for really good reason based on all the people in our family and in our household, those are great reasons to consider things like, that the patriarchy might have influenced. But yeah, I know we're talking about something broader than that. Yeah, the other thing I would say about that is challenge ourselves to consider if this is what we really want to be doing or wearing versus, that external. And just that reminder, I said it this way when I sort of asked you this question, but that reminder that when we're looking too far outside of ourselves, we're really kind of like diluting our power and giving it away. And so even if it's helpful for people to work with concepts of like literally pulling their power and decision making back from lots of different places that perhaps you feel the patriarchy has helped you to push it out to the masses versus keeping it in here, all of that stuff is really good stuff.
I love the concept, Angela, of holding on to your power and I get a lot of people wanting to talk about empowerment in my office and how do I feel empowered? There's so much helplessness out there. Um,
Mhm.
yeah, and as simple and not simple as it is, being aware of who's holding the power is a really big question.
Agreed. And I think it helps us to consider things like matriarchal systems because it might not be comfortable for people to start out thinking about how to hold the power. I have a
Mm,
couple different ideas kind of running through my brain or bombing in psychically, as happens to me a lot, of so many women that have done the sandwich thing and raised kids and done things for the right reason for the parents, all of that where like perhaps even have the patriarchy and caregiving and all of that just more deeply ingrained in their decisions than I have had certainly in the last few years. And thinking about that a lot and just starting with kind of what makes you happy, you know, and smaller bites because it can
mhm.
potentially feel really overwhelming and dare I say destabilizing. Not I don't I think the release of the files themselves has been destabilizing in a lot of ways and triggering for a lot of people, of course. But even just acknowledging that we're having a really big conversation about so when we start looking at how the patriarchy affects your life, it can be really big. So overwhelming is a better term, I think, than destabilizing. But yeah, just starting small and starting with more comfortable bits, I think is a great idea for our audiences too.
Yeah, and even Angela, when you said I talked about empowerment, and then you said power as a tool of patriarchy, and I was like, another yes, another example of freaking how I didn't even see it. Yeah. Anyway, I don't need to keep saying it, but boy, I'm really glad we're having this conversation because just for me, it is opening up
Mhm.
my eyes, and I was prepared for this conversation. I didn't think my eyes were
Mhm.
going to be quite so opened. So I'm really glad we're talking about this.
Good, good, good. The other thing I think is helpful to add is that we don't, as we all sit with this concept of the patriarchy and how it's a system that's affected so much of all the things that we do, right? And that, I say sort of dramatically, we're all born in the cult of patriarchy, and that's true. Really just being gentle with yourselves and taking it at your own pace, I think is the best advice that we can also offer. And remind people that it doesn't mean that you have to take action. It doesn't mean that if you have feelings come up about being really angry at the patriarchy, that you've got to, give your partner the cold shoulder if they happen to be a man or whatever, or hate on men. It doesn't, the one doesn't equate the other. And so just wanting to give permission, offer permission to everyone that's listening that, stepping into this concept and thinking about this in your life and how it's affected you does not mean that you have to go be man-hating or that you have to have a fight with your partner or whatever, have to break up with them. Again, the patriarchy has us thinking about productivity and taking action, right? It's a very think of manufacturing lines, right? Assembly lines, like all this was very patriarchal. And so it's very normal for us to start thinking in those terms. And so I'm just wanting us to remind our listeners that you do not have to take action from this. You can really just sit with and think about these things at your pace, at your comfort level, and just know that there are these really, these bigger ahas that are really being spelled out now for so many of us around this.
Yeah, I think self-care is ultimately the foundation that we want to be espousing, and yeah, the gentleness with yourself, I think gentleness with ourselves is super important and needs to be prioritized.
Agreed. And I will add, rest and the need for rest comes straight out of the matriarchy. It took me a long time. I don't know if you're there yet or if you've dealt with this. I have because, recent empty nester, so thinking about my life differently as a single person and all of that. But I had to really do a lot of deprogramming to be okay with resting, even if that meant that it was like 3 days in a row where I just wasn't moving as much and all the things, wasn't cleaning. And so just the concept of rest is such a gift from the matriarchy. And I think if there were one takeaway for our whole audience, gosh, I hope people decide to rest more as a result of what we're all moving through. And these realizations of sort of how much we've exhausted ourselves through the patriarchal systems. So I'm encouraging our audience to rest and honor rest and think about the concept of rest for yourself in ways that support you and feel nurturing and self-loving.
I second that.
Right on. Any last comments before we close, Suzanne?
I don't think so, other than, just really appreciating the frame about um, patriarchy as a hierarchical system. And as you said, when there's a hierarchy, there's somebody at the top and there's somebody at the bottom. And
Mhm.
that does not need to be the case. And if we can start to wean ourselves away from that kind of system and imagine what a matriarchy would feel like, or imagine, just what a nice relationship with yourself would feel like, what an aligned relationship with yourself would feel like. Doesn't have to be, doesn't have to fit into any category, patriarchy, matriarchy. It can just be, being aligned with yourself. That's always where um, I was going to say power. That's where your sense of self comes from. That's where your solid ground comes from. Um, so I'm wishing everybody rest and self-care.
Beautiful. Thank you, Dr. Suzanne Manser. It's been a blast to be here with you today in our Psyched chat on YouTube. I am Angela with Energy Intuit, and we thank you guys for being here today. Remember that you can always feel free to drop us a message or drop comments below if there's a topic that you would like to hear us chat about. We love ideas, so feel free to feed them to us. And we wish you all restful and restorative weekends. Take care of yourselves. Thanks for being here.